but not all mur- not all homicides are murders, and I think it's important that we clear that up. If you think of side, that is the killing part, and homa is like mankind. So homicide, the killing of a member of mankind. Regicide, for example, is the killing of a king. Familicide is the killing of a family. So let's see what takes something from homicide to a murder. Okay, some of you may recognize our mutual friend Wolfenhowler here. Do you see her there? You probably might not be able to make out, but she's skewering me through the crotch with a sword. Now, that is what we call actus reus, and that means a guilty act. That is only half of the equation for what would meet a criminal act of homicide. You also have this other aspect, mens rea, which you can see coming out of her head in the little thought bubble. Does she have a guilty mind? So it's not just the act that matters, but it's whether the person knows if what they're doing is illegal or wrong. So think of murder as, or manslaughter to varying extents, as actus reus plus mens rea. Guilty act, guilty mind. This started in the United Kingdom with the case of Daniel Macnaghten. Daniel Macnaghten was a Scottish wood turner, and in his late 20s, he started to get a little paranoid. He would have delusions. By 1843, he was seen skulking around London. Was the Whitehall district particularly acting a little strange. And Macnaghten believed that he was being persecuted by the Tory government. At that time, the Tory government, that's the Conservatives, were led by Sir Robert Peel, and his picture is actually up there at the back of the room. And the reason that we've got him in there is because he was the founder of the first modern police force. At the time, he was the prime minister, and Macnaghten was convinced that Sir Robert Peel and the Tory party were indeed persecuting him. And so on January the 23rd, 1843, he followed Edward Drummond, who was Sir Robert Peel's personal secretary. He followed him through the streets of London. He pulled a pistol and he shot Drummond in the back. Now, the police were on Macnaghten very quickly, and they restrained him just as he was about to pull out another pistol. But when they questioned him, they realized, hold on, this guy is not completely with it. And it's interesting to note that Drummond was initially okay. It's not like he had a fatal wound. He died 5 days later, most likely from medical malpractice. But what is important is the trial of Daniel Macnaghten. So that begins on March 2nd. So within 2 months, and though the wheels of justice moved very quickly at this time in history, this was particularly expeditious. And one of the reasons that people have speculated about was that there were a group of lawyers and medical professionals in the United Kingdom at that time who were just waiting for a case like Daniel Macnaghten's to implement some major changes in British law. And so when they asked Daniel Macnaghten, why did you kill Edward Drummond? First of all, one of the rumors is he thought it was Prime Minister Robert Peel, which is a difficult mistake to make if you're completely sane. But he said, I was driven to desperation by persecution. I said, okay. And they pushed him a little farther. And he said, well, I'm guilty of firing. Well, guilty of firing, what is that? That's the actus reus, the guilty act. But there's still questions about his mind. And actually, both sides, the prosecution and the defense, both agreed that Macnaghten was suffering from delusions of persecution. That is, he believed he was being persecuted by the Tory government. Nothing that you could tell him could change his mind, but that wasn't actually happening. And so he was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Well, Queen Victoria got pretty pissed off about that. This was not her idea of British justice. So she wanted an inquiry into it. And so a bunch of nobles doctors, bourgeoisie got together, they put their brains together, and this resulted in the McNaughton rules, which became then enshrined into law. And they're as follows. To establish a defense on the ground of insanity, it must be clearly proved that, at the time of committing the act, the party accused was laboring under such a defect of reason from disease of the mind as not to know the nature and quality of the act he was doing, or, if he did know it, that he did not know what he was doing was wrong. And these McNaughton rules are then in place for at least 100 years in Britain, the Commonwealth countries, and the United States. They really form the basis of our idea of whether somebody is legally sane when they commit a crime or legally insane. And I should point out to you that we often use the terms sane and insane colloquially. We think that they are tantamount to mental illness, but you can be mentally ill and still sane. Sane is, did you know what you were doing was wrong legally? It goes to the mens rea. Okay. There's, of course, instances of homicide where you kill somebody and it's not illegal. So war is a good example of this. If you kill someone in war, according to international laws, then it's not considered a crime, as long as it's not a war crime. In places where the capital punishment is homicide, but it's not murder because it's not illegal. Euthanasia, the same way. This particular case here is a good demonstration. This is the case of George Saavedra. He was 14 years old and he was attending West Palmetto High School in Naples, Florida, which I believe is West Florida. And he was being bullied mercilessly. He would ride the bus home from school, and there would be older boys in the back throwing stuff at him, threatening him constantly. We're going to beat you up any day now. You're going to get it. The school dealt with it for a little bit. They banned those boys from the bus, but eventually they had to let them back on. And we've all been through high school, I think, or in it. And so you know that those flames start to flare up again. And it got so bad that George was actually missing school. He was walking to school a long distance without taking the bus just to try and avoid the conflict. And then on January 24th, 2011, he had no other option, unfortunately. One of the main bullies, a kid 2 years older than him, 16-year-old Dylan Nuno, approached him with a group of other boys and said, well, today's the day that you're going to get your beating that we've been promising you all year. And he was on the bus with them. Now, George does everything he can to get out of this situation. He gets off the bus a few stops early. Okay, well, the boys just note this and they get off at the next stop, and then they come and they meet him halfway. He turns his back to try and get away from them. They start punching him in the back of the head. And that's when George pulls out his pocket knife and stabs Dylan Nuno 12 times in the torso and abdomen. 2 of those blows are fatal. George is obviously arrested. And then there's sort of a fact-finding time when the judge has to decide, well, does this go to trial? The judge looked at this case and interpreted it in light of the Florida standard ground law and said, well, no. I mean, first of all, in Florida, you're not obligated to have to try and get away, but you even did that. And you are being threatened with violence. You were forced into a situation where you had to defend yourself, where you could reasonably expect severe bodily harm to you. And so, therefore, George Saavedra, his case didn't even make it to trial. It was considered self-defense. So I'm not here. This is not morality and law class. I'm not here to give you my opinion on whether that's right or wrong, nor do I really want to hear yours, although we could always talk about it later after class. But the point is that you can commit homicides within a society that aren't murder. So now that we've established that, let's look at what is murder and manslaughter. So this is from my home country of Canada. This case is very close to me. This is the murder of 8-year-old Tori Stafford. If you're interested in learning more about this case, go to my podcast, murderwasthecase.com. Sorry, Murder Was the Case. And episode 100, I speak to Tori's dad. It's a pretty heartbreaking episode. The person on the left there is Terry Lynn McClintock. She was 19 at the time. And the person on the right was her boyfriend, Michael Rafferty. Together, they planned to abduct an 8-year-old girl, and we'll just run with that. So 8-year-old Tori Stafford is standing outside her school, Oliver Stevens Elementary School, and she is approached by Terry Lynn McClintock. Terry Lynn says, "Hey, would you like to see a puppy dog in the car?" Tori trusts her. She follows her and goes over to this car. There's no puppy dog in the car. There is, however, Michael Rafferty. And at this point, she probably realizes she's been tricked, but it's too late. They bundle her into the car and drive off. The first place they head is to a hardware store where they pick up garbage bags and a hammer. They drive little 8-year-old Tori out into the countryside where nobody is really around to see what's happening. And there, Michael Rafferty proceeds to rape her over and over in the car. When he's finally done, Terry Lynn McClintock throws the little girl on the floor, stomps and kicks her, breaking her ribs, all sorts of things. And then they put her in a garbage bag, and Terry Lynn McClintock beats her to death with a hammer. They leave the body concealed out in the countryside and are eventually caught for it, prosecuted, and both convicted of first-degree murder. So what makes this first-degree murder? Well, we know that it's premeditated. That's a big aspect of it. It has malice aforethought, okay? So we know it's premeditated because they've clearly set up this trap, and on the way to the site from where the abduction occurs to the site where the rape will occur, they stop at the hardware store and they pick up the instruments of murder that they need to commit this foul act. So beyond that, too, they take her to a place where no one can see, and they conceal the body, and they don't tell anyone about it. So they clearly know that what they're doing is both morally wrong and illegal. They just don't actually care. So that is what will qualify you for a first-degree murder charge and conviction. Second-degree murder now. We'll keep it in Canada while I have you. Meet Dr. Mohammed Shamji, once a world-renowned neurosurgeon. He was married to Dr. Elena Frick Shamji. They met in 2003 and married in 2004. They had 3 children, and they were living in Toronto. Dr. Shamji was working at a local hospital, and he had a great bedside manner. A lot of people liked him, but they led a double life. He actually controlled her social media account. He would make it look like that they lived this happy life of prosperity, travel, exciting extreme sports. And in reality, he was tailoring an image of what their couple looked like to the world. The truth is that behind closed doors, he was physically and sexually and verbally abusive towards her. And on November the 28th, 2016, she had finally had enough, and she formally filed divorce papers. But she continued to live in the same home as him. She moved down into the basement, but they lived in a place called North York in a big, nice house in Toronto. And so she was living in the basement. He's living upstairs. Their kids are still there. And on November 30th, 2 days after the divorce papers are filed, Elena calls her mother, and her mother says, "I'm worried about you." Elena says, "Don't worry. He won't do anything stupid." Well, unfortunately, Elena was wrong about that. Mohammed Shamji beats her badly, breaks her neck, and chokes her to death. He then puts her body in a suitcase, drives it out to the countryside, and leaves it underneath an underpass where it's found. And of course, given this guy's history of abuse and how many people know about the divorce. It gets back to him. He goes to trial and he's convicted of second-degree murder. So why second degree? What makes this case different than the previous case we discussed? Well, there was no evidence that Dr. Shamji had planned out this killing. What most likely took place is you had two people in a very volatile and incendiary situation inhabiting the same space, and they ran into each other. Tensions are inflamed by these divorce papers. We know he's a very controlling man, and in the heat of an argument, he loses it. We can see that by the fact that he doesn't employ any weapons, actually, that everything seems to be done with his own hands. So breaking her neck, beating her, choking her manually. And so that's basically the difference between a first-degree murder and a second-degree murder, is that there is no planning in this. It just sort of happened. And I'll explain what that is coming up. But we've got to also talk about voluntary manslaughter. I may be about to show you a murder in VR. Watch closely. This is in 1984 at a Baton Rouge airport in Louisiana. The man you'll be seeing walking through here, his name is Jeffrey Doucette. He has been arrested for abducting and molesting a 11-year-old boy. Take a look at what happens to Jeff. Phone booth. I had to cut that off, of course, but if you're watching closely, there's a man standing at the phone booth there, waiting for him, and as soon as he passed, the man drew a pistol, put it up to his temple, fired one shot through Jeffrey Doucette's temple, killing him. Well, that seems like a pretty bad crime, wouldn't you agree? I mean, he's waiting there for him, and he's clearly looking to kill. It's not like an act of violence that where it was just an assault gone wrong. But what is key here is that Gary Plauché, the gunman, it was his son that Jeffrey Doucette had abducted, brought to Disneyland, and repeatedly sexually abused the month before. Doucette had made the mistake of allowing Gary's son, Jody, to call his mother from a motel room in California and tell her that he was okay. And that's what brought the police on to Jeffrey Doucette, and they arrested him. They returned Jody back. So Gary Plauché did know that Jeffrey was going to be coming through this airport, and he planned it. But at the same time, he is convicted of voluntary manslaughter. So what's that all about? He gets a 7-year suspended sentence, 5 years probation, and 300 hours of community service. And so voluntary manslaughter is basically when you cause the death of a human in a manner which is less culpable than murder. And there's 3 excuses, really, that can get you a voluntary manslaughter charge or conviction. And the one that applies here is causing the death of a human in a manner which is less culpable. Is the heat of passion, which happens after provocation and no time to cool off afterwards. Well, we can certainly say that Jeffrey Doucette provoked Plauché by abducting and repeatedly molesting his son, hence the voluntary manslaughter charge. Once again, it's not morality in law class. I'm not here to weigh in with my opinion, but there's voluntary manslaughter. There's also involuntary manslaughter. Anyone recognize this guy? This was Michael Jackson's doctor, Conrad Murray. And he had been Michael Jackson's doctor for just a few months before something pretty terrible went down. Michael Jackson was known for suffering from insomnia. He was a workaholic, and he just couldn't get to sleep. He couldn't turn it off. Maybe some of you can relate. And so he had Conrad Murray on as a doctor to give him drugs that you were not supposed to legally or medically give someone for sleeping problems. I'm talking about intravenous, so that's going into the veins, administration of propofol mixed with a cocktail of other drugs. Now, propofol is used as anesthesia. Okay, it's not used for sleeping, and it's always to be used in a hospital setting where people are closely monitored. You do not use it for sleep, but Conrad Murray supplied it to Jackson anyways. He did not closely monitor him. He left the room, and on June 25th, 2009, Michael Jackson had a cardiac arrest and died. Conrad Murray was eventually charged with involuntary manslaughter and convicted of that in a court. And I believe he also lost his license to practice medicine. So there you have it. We have homicide, which isn't murder. We have first-degree murder, second-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter. Are there plenty of others? You bet there are, but we don't have the time to go through all that today. I just wanted to give you like the basics, really. Okay, we're going to move on now to more criminological concepts and less legal ones. The difference between instrumental and reactive violence. Remember the two cases we discussed. Over here, we have the case of McClintock and Rafferty, and over here, we have the case of Mohammed Shamji. This was a first-degree murder conviction, second-degree murder conviction. Instrumental violence is premeditated violence with a goal. So, if I decide that I'm going to go and break someone's kneecaps to get the money they owe me, then that is premeditated, and it has a very specific goal to get the money. Instrumental violence. That would be what is in the case of McClintock and Rafferty. We already said how they planned this all out, and the goal was to abduct Tori Stafford and obtain deviant sexual gratification from this poor 8-year-old girl. It's instrumental violence. Most people are not capable of it. It's a very rare subsect of society, and psychopaths are overrepresented as those who commit acts of instrumental violence. That's something that I'm going to get to in the next lecture. Now, Mohammed Shamji's killing was more of a case of reactive violence. This is something that actually we're all capable of. It's that feeling, it's that idea of don't push my buttons. It's that in the moment where you're arguing with someone, your emotions are flaring, they're in your face, there's a back and forth, and then somebody snaps and loses it, and before they know what they've done, a act of violence has been committed. So instrumental violence, premeditated, goal-oriented, most people aren't capable of it. Reactive, hot-blooded, just kind of happens, and yeah, we all have the capacity for that. Not that it's always just one or the other. Meet Bernard Giles. Bernard Giles was a serial killer in Florida, and between September and November of 1973, he killed 5 young female hitchhikers between the ages of 14 and 22. Giles was only 20 himself at the time, actually. It was around the Titusville area of Florida, which I believe is in the northeast, lots of orange groves. And so what Giles would do is he would pick up these hitchhikers with a plan in mind to kill them. Once they were in his car, he would pull a gun on them. And then he would say, you're under my control now and you're going to do what I want you to do. Well, yeah, most of them went along with that. So he'd drive out to an orange grove and he would tell them, hey, march into the trees here. As they're marching into the trees, he'd take the gun, bang, shoot them in the back of the head. Now, that's instrumental violence. He planned that out. His goal was that it satisfied him to kill these young females, to watch them die. But, and this is where we get kind of gross. Well, I mean, the whole thing's pretty awful, but this is where we get into the real sewer of it. He found himself unexpectedly becoming turned on after he had shot the women. The act of killing them turned him on. And so then he committed reactive violence to the bodies after. And what I'm talking about is he would have sex with their dead bodies. after the fact. That wasn't something that he planned, at least not for the first few. He had just planned to kill them, instrumental, premeditated, goal-oriented. But then, in the heat of the moment, when it was all done, this turned into a reactive post-mortem sexual assault. Can also go the other way. Jeffrey McDonald, Fort Bragg, a military base in North Carolina, 1970. Jeffrey McDonald, he still won't admit guilt to it to this day, but reconstruction of events basically says this is what happened. He was arguing with his wife, and she was pregnant, and they had 2 daughters. The daughters were respectively, I think they're about 3 and 18 months, something in that area. And he's having a sort of Muhammad Shamji situation where with his wife, they're in the bedroom, they're arguing back and forth. He picks up a club of some sort and swings it back to hit his wife, hot-blooded. He doesn't know that his little daughter is behind him, hits her by accident, causes massive injury, perhaps death. Then all of a sudden, he's transported out of this hot-blooded reactive violence situation into knowing that now, when he's caught for doing this, that he is going to be spending a lot of time in prison. So now he flips into goal-oriented murder, premeditated. And so he thinks to himself, what do I do about this? Well, I've got to kill all the witnesses. So then he kills his wife, stabs her dozens of times. He kills both of his daughters, stabs them dozens of times. He places their bodies, that is of his daughters, in their bed, and he writes this in their blood on the headboard. If you can't make that out, it says pig. Now keep in mind, this is 1970. What happened the year before it in 1969 involving the word pig in a homicide? If you've seen Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, well, I guess it didn't get to that point, but if you're familiar with the Manson murders, that's exactly what it was. So what he's done is he's gone from a reactive violence situation in which he accidentally severely hurt one of his kids to the instrumental violence of, I've got to take out my whole family or I'm going to get into trouble for this. But then he's got to stage it to make it look like somebody else did it. So when he calls the police at 3:42 a.m., his story is, people broke into my house and they killed my wife and daughters, and they were chanting, death to pigs, kill the pigs, acid is groovy. That's what he was doing. Now that's right out of the Charles Manson story. And he signals to this pig on the headboard to prove this. He has some superficial wounds himself. He has a concussion. He has some scratches on himself. And he has one tiny, shallow little stab wound here, which was believed to be self-inflicted. And so they pretty much quickly picked that story apart. And as of 1979, it took a while, but Jeffrey McDonald was convicted of the murder of his family. So that's instrumental violence and reactive violence, and how the two aren't always entirely separate. And we've briefly touched on the concept of staging here too. I'll say this while I have you. Why would you stage a crime scene? To make it look like something else happened? If you were a stranger, would you bother? No, because you're never going to fall on the police radar. You're going to stage a crime scene if you are someone that you believe is going to come under suspicion. And generally that means that you know the victim and are likely to come on the police radar. Let's just now quickly blow through different types of homicide. Okay, good, making good time. Let's just blow through the different variations of homicide. We'll call this murder by numbers. You have, of course, your single homicide. Mark David Chapman, who decided he wanted to kill John Lennon because he was a phony, and that he would sort of psychologically cannibalize John Lennon, acquiring his fame and become the catcher in the rye from the J.D. Salinger novel. That's a wacky story. I'll try and get into that in subsequent lectures. But yeah, Chapman just hunts down John Lennon, and in December of 1980, finds him outside the Dakota building where he was living in New York City, and he pulls out a .38 special, fires 5 shots at him with hollow point bullets. 4 hit John Lennon in the back, take John Lennon out, and as it's a single homicide in a single incident, thus single homicide or murder. Anyone remember Susan Smith? I think probably one of America's least favorite mothers. Susan Smith had 2 boys, Michael, age 3, and Alexander, 14 months. And she was in an affair with a powerful businessman. And she was enamored with this guy. But he said to her at one point, look, there's just aspects of your life that I can't deal with. Things that I don't want to add to my life. And particularly, I'm talking about your kids. I'm just, I don't want that in my life. So Susan Smith just makes the decision to, okay, he doesn't want my kids in his life. Well, I can solve that. And she takes her 2 sons, Michael and Alexander. And on October 25th, 1994, she puts them inside her car and she lets it roll into John D. Long Lake, and they drown in there. This is in Union County, South Carolina, by the way. She calls the police that day and she says, help, I was carjacked. A black man came along and he stole my car and my kids are in it. And so there's a big panic. Everyone in the neighborhood is looking for these kids. But the police are pretty sharp. And they notice that she's giving these public statements in which she appears to be crying, but there are no tears, and that there are inconsistencies and things that simply could not have happened in her own account. So she becomes a suspect. They pile on a little bit of pressure, and she confesses to killing the 2 little boys. 2 children killed in the same location, in the same event, basically at the same time. That's a double homicide. Triple homicide, more or less the same thing. We return to Canada, meet Justin Bourque. I'll try and keep this one short. He basically was obsessed with guns and sort of militia culture. He dressed in camo and he had a semi-automatic rifle and a shotgun. He left his trailer and made a big display of walking down the street in his trailer park carrying these weapons. So people were rightfully distressed by this. They called the police. 12 Mounties, or Royal Canadian Mounted Police, as we call them, the RCMP, showed up to try and deal with this situation. At some point, Justin Bourque fires upon them, and there's a big shootout. And by the end of the day, actually, within a period of less than an hour, he has killed 3 officers and wounded 2 others. And so as this is, once again, basically in the same event, same location, same time, this is what we would call a triple murder. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, what's he going to do next? Quadruple murder? How long are we going to go with this nonsense? Actually, when you get to 4 or more, you enter the realm of what we call mass murder. And then at that point, it doesn't matter if it's 4 or 168. Timothy McVeigh. Timothy McVeigh was probably the face of terrorism in America in the 1990s. He rented a Ryder truck, put a bomb in it, which I think it had something like 4,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate in it, and he drove this Ryder van outside the Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Then he set the fuse and took off. It blew up, as I said, 168 people killed, 600 wounded. It didn't just get men and women working for the government that were McVeigh's main targets. He had this whole anti-government stance, but it also blew up a daycare and killed little kids in there too. So a mass murder is 4 or more, as we can see, it's gone into the hundreds at a single location in a single event, basically around the same time. Although we do have kind of subgroups of this. You might recognize this guy. I would say that he's probably the first face of gun violence against strangers on a mass level in America. This goes all the way back to 1966 in Austin, Texas. Meet Charles Whitman, former military, and he was married and seemingly had a normal life, except on August the 1st, 1966. He went to the University of Texas at Austin campus, and he climbed the UT Tower, went up to the 28th floor, and he took out a rifle and a number of other firearms and just started opening fire on people. So he killed 14 people and wounded another 31 in a period of just 96 minutes. Of course, this is Texas, so you've got police and civilians down at the ground level shooting back at him. They manage to storm the tower. They get all the way up, and one of the, I believe it was 4 men who did this, shoots Charles Whitman and puts an end to it. Well, they don't know it. His name is Charles Whitman at the time. They say, well, who's this guy that's done this? We need to find out about him. They go through his personal effects. They identify him. And then they find out that the same day beforehand, he had killed his mother, probably by stabbing her heart. By stabbing her in the heart, accounts differ as to what really happened. And then he killed his wife, stabbing her 3 times in the heart. Then he went and wrote a note, something we'll look at in later lectures. But the point is that Whitman was a mass murderer in that he'd committed the bulk of his murders on the University of Texas at Austin campus, but they weren't all of them. The same day before, there was kind of a prelude to it where he took out these 2 members of his family. So we call that bifurcated mass murder. That's mass murder with a little bit of a preamble. Another example of this is Sung-Hoo Cho. April 16th, 2007, 23-year-old Cho goes to across the campus where he's attending school for English at Virginia Tech University in Blacksburg, Virginia. He kills Emily Hilscher, and he kills another young man in this one building. He returns to his own dorm. He puts a video cassette in a package and sends it to NBC News. And then he goes to the Norris Hall building. He chains the doors shut so that no one can enter. He pulls out his Glock and his Walter, and then he just starts shooting students randomly, staff randomly, and he kills 30 just within Norris Hall before the police start to be able to break down the door and close in on him, and then he kills himself. So up until rather recently with the Pulse nightclub and Vegas shootings, Cho, this bifurcated mass murderer, was the most prolific mass murderer by handgun in the history of the United States with a total count of 32. Then we have mass shooters. You hear this used much more than mass murderers now, but a mass shooter is someone that shoots 4 or more people, but doesn't kill 4 or more. So meet Kim Veer-Gill. Actually, when I was going to university in Montreal, I was heading there on the bus one day, and the buses were all lined up and going slow. And I'm thinking, I'm going to be late to class. This was a 400 level class. I'm going to get in a lot of trouble. This would have been, I think, 2006, so the year before Cho. And so I decided to get off the bus, and I kind of power walked it to my class, get in there. I'm all sweaty and tired. And I look around, and everyone just seems really glum and non-conversational. The teacher walks in. She says, "I suppose you all heard what happened at Dawson College." And everyone sort of nods solemnly. I said, "No, I don't know what's going on." She said, "Well, a gunman has walked into Dawson College and shot a bunch of people." And I wasn't a student at Dawson College, but it was really just blocks to the west of where I was. So this is the closest I've ever come to a mass shooting to my knowledge. Kim Veer-Gill, however, he wounded 19 people, but only killed one 18-year-old Anastasia D'Souza. So he is a mass shooter. not a mass murderer. Spree killers up next. The FBI doesn't want you to believe that this is a real category anymore, but I'm going to make an argument that it is a very important concept. Does anyone remember Christopher Dorner? This is a fascinating case, which I wish I had more time to get into, actually. Christopher Dorner was a member of the LAPD. He had military training before that. And in 2008, he was working with a partner when there was a man with some mental issues causing some problems in a hotel lobby. And they went to deal with the situation, but Dorner perceived that his partner had used undue force, excessive force on this man. So he filed a report to the LAPD. And this came before a review board where a number of people testified. And it was eventually determined that Dorner had lied. Now, I don't know what the truth of this is. Apparently, some people have looked into this and said, actually, Dorner was telling the truth, and this was like an LAPD cover-up. But it didn't really matter. The point is, then in 2008, they fired Christopher Dorner from the LAPD for lying. This was a guy who cared a lot about being a cop, and it was his whole identity, and certainly having a stellar reputation. So he files numerous appeals, not getting anywhere. He's fighting an uphill battle against the man. And I guess in that 5 years, that battle took its toll on his mind. And on February the 1st, 2013, he sends a DVD of his case to Anderson Cooper at CNN. And February 3rd, he waits outside the apartment of the former police chief's daughter, Monica Kwan, and her fiance, Keith Lawrence, and he shoots them both. February 4th, he posts on Facebook that he is waging asymmetrical and unconventional warfare against the LAPD. And he's off. This is what a spree killer is, essentially. They kill 2 or more people in separate locations or separate events, you might say, but they never really return to the routine of their normal life. Once they're committed, they're all in. So he spends almost 2 weeks stealing cars, driving around, shooting at police officers. He manages to kill 2 members of he kills a member of the LAPD, and I think he kills a member of the San Bernardino sheriffs, if I'm recalling correctly. But eventually they track him to Big Bear Lake. He's holed up in a cabin. There's a big standoff. The next thing we know, the cabin catches fire. And by the time the flames are out, they find him dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. But as you can see, he's not like the mass murderer. His attitude is kind of the same. I'm committed to this. I will die doing this, fighting this war. But rather than just going to a single location, like the University of Texas, or to the Virginia Tech, or to the Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City, he's driving all over the LA area, taking out his war against the police. So despite what the FBI says, I think spree killer is a pretty legit category, and you have to contrast them with the final category. Pick the clicker. Hold on. Waiting. Which is the serial killer. A serial killer, the classic definition of a serial killer, is somebody who kills 3 people in three or more people in 3 or more separate incidents with a cooling off period in between. As of 2005, 2006, there was a conference in Texas where a bunch of FBI agents and luminaries in the study of murder all congregated. And they decided, you know what? this cooling off period, it's ambiguous. We don't really know how to define it. So let's just get rid of it. So the new definition for serial killer became kill two or more people in separate events. Well, that is just far too broad for me. I like moving it to two or more because there's plenty of cases, even famous cases such as the one of Ed Gein, which inspired the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which we have them in the canon of serial killers. So I don't have a problem so much with changing it, the number from 3 to 2, but we need to acknowledge this cooling off period. And if cooling off is not defined well enough, well, let me replace it with what I will call a return to routine. So when we were talking about these rampage murderers, the mass murderers, the spree killers, once they had committed to committing a number of homicides, they never went back to their normal life. They never went back to work. They never returned to this routine, even if the routine is fairly deviant. Serial killers are special in the way that they do actually do that. And one example here that most people haven't heard of, but you could take Ted Bundy, Gary Ridgway, and even Samuel Little, who's recently been in the news. All the most prolific American serial killers, put their body counts together. They have nothing on the monster of the Andes, Pedro Lopez. Pedro Lopez killed between 1969 and it was either 2000 or 2002 when he stopped. So that was a long reign of terror. He would wander between Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, and he would rape and strangle girls, usually around the age of 12. When he was finally caught in Ecuador, he admitted to killing as many as 300, if not more. And so it wasn't that he would strangle one and rape them and then go immediately to another and do that. No, he would look for victims. He would look for opportunities. He would wait till the urge built up in him. And then he would rape and strangle these young girls. And then he would return to his routine. And his routine was, he had some lowly kind of laboring jobs. He liked to wander about a bit. But it was hardly the sort of blazing, glorious ending that we see in these rampage murderers. He enjoyed doing this. He took such pleasure from this that he didn't want to get caught. So he would have his little bit of joy, and then he would blend back in, and he'd wait and come out and have his little bit of joy. Once again, 300 victims between 1969 and roughly the start of the 21st century. Just to make you feel a little bit more comfortable, did you know that he is currently not incarcerated in a prison and his whereabouts are unknown? Yeah. So there are pretty lax laws in both Ecuador and Colombia, at least at that time there was, about how long you can keep someone in prison. So Pedro Lopez, last seen leaving a psychiatric institute in Colombia, and now we don't know where he is. So that number could be up to somewhere near 600 now. Okay, so let's see. We'll take a look very quickly at the types of serial killers because I know that this is a interesting topic for many people. You have serial killers that kill because, like Daniel McNaughton, who we talked about earlier, they are psychotic, meaning they are either delusional or schizophrenic or have something in that realm. And there's probably no better example of that than Herb Mullen. Herb Mullen noticed that as the Vietnam War was scaling down, that there seemed to be more earthquakes in California, and he concluded that Mother Earth wasn't getting enough blood sacrifice. So as a result, he decided that to stop the earthquakes, he needed to go around killing people. And he did. He killed 13 of them, all because of this strange delusion that he had. In the Holmes typology, this is what is known as a visionary serial killer. Then we have people who kill for political, religious, ideological reasons. In the Holmes typology, we call them missionary serial killers. This is probably someone you haven't heard of, but this is, to my knowledge, the only jihadist serial killer, Ali Muhammad Brown. My good friend, Detective Cloyd Steiger, was actually a part of the arrest, and he interviewed Ali Muhammad Brown. If you want to check out what Cloyd has to say about that, that's in one of my podcast episodes. Once again, Murder Was the Case. Ali Muhammad Brown was a fanatical Muslim extremist, and he ultimately wanted to make it to the Middle East and join ISIS, but he was having a hard time doing that, getting out of the country, getting the funds to. So he just reasoned to himself, well, while I'm here, why don't I wage jihad? And so he just randomly killed. The first instance was around the Seattle area, killed a young black man. Then around Seattle, he killed two. He killed a gay man in Seattle, a gay black man, I think, who was also a Muslim. And then over in New Jersey, he killed someone there too. And why? Because he was on a mission. He was on jihad. And what you'll see about these two types of murderers, the Herb Mullen, the visionary, and the missionary, is that it's about the act of killing. That is the central part, make someone stop existing. So things like torture and rape, they don't seem to factor in as much because they are act-focused murderers, as are profit-motivated, hedonist comfort killers. This is the one category where we actually see an overrepresentation of female serial killers. Meet Belle Gunness. She's believed to have killed 14 plus people, mainly men, but also her own children. She was in Illinois and Indiana and operated between 1884 and 1908. What Belle liked to do was she had a farm, and she would put out classified ads. She says, I'm a unmarried woman. I'm looking for a man who has money to come and marry me and live with me on the farm. Triflers may not apply. So in other words, she don't want no scrubs kind of thing. And so these guys would show up with money on their person to prove to her that, yes, look, I've got money. I'm not going to be a parasite leeching off you. And then they would come out to her remote farmhouse with this, at which point Belle, who was about 6 feet tall, would take an axe and slaughter them and take their money. The ending of her story is actually kind of interesting because it ends with a fire at the farm where the bodies of her children are found in the inferno. And at the time, it's assumed that Belle perishes among them, but there are some rumors that she may have escaped. But she was motivated, as you can see, primarily by profit. And she just used the axe, once again, act focus, or maybe I could use a pun, axe focused, just to get rid of them to get the money. When we look at process-focused killers, they tend to be more of a sexual kind. You have people like Fred West in the United Kingdom, who had all sorts of deviant fetishes and paraphilias. That's something I'm going to talk about in Lecture 5. And along with the help of his wife, Rose, they would abduct teenage women and women in their early 20s, I believe, and they would take them down to their basement, which was a dungeon. They'd hang them up in chains and rape and torture them, sometimes for weeks at a time. Then after the fact, actually before he killed them, he would actually cut their fingers off while they were still alive, because this was sexually arousing to him. We're going to get to it all. I know it's strange. And after killing them, he would take great pleasure in dismembering the bodies. He would take knuckles, fingers, etc. as trophies. And he even once admitted to having sex with the dead bodies. So you could say that Fred West was motivated by a kind of deviant lust, and he was more about the process of torture and rape than the actual killing itself. You have ones that do similar things, but it's more about the thrill. You're going to see this guy. You heard it from me first. I bet you he's going to be in season 3 of Mindhunter. Robert Hansen, the butcher baker, he lived in Alaska, and he would take prostitutes out to his cabin in the Alaskan wilderness on a plane, and he would rape and torture them there too. But then for the thrill of it, at the end, he would set them free and chase after them through the Alaskan wilderness with a hunting rifle. Like, this sounds like something right out of a movie. It's almost surreal. And he would shoot them dead like he was hunting wild game. So we could say that he was motivated by the thrill of doing it. And finally, we have offenders, once again, who rape and torture their victims. In this case, we have John Wayne Gacy, 33 known victims, in the late 70s, kept the majority of them under his crawl space and in his home. And it was really, for Gacy, it was very much about a power thing. I have the power to have you completely at my mercy. I can choose whether you live or die. He had something called the rope trick. He had put a length of rope around their neck, and then he would insert in a broomstick handle, and then he would twist it. So what happens when you twist this broomstick handle in a loop of rope? It tightens it up, right? You can try it on your own finger with a piece of string and a pencil. And so then you can strangle someone and bring them to the brink of death. And just as they're about to go unconscious or expire, you just turn it the other way. It loosens it. You let them catch their breath, and they get it again. Now, to end, I think that the first three categories here, the visionary, missionary, and hedonist comfort, are pretty valid. But I think these last three cases, Fred West, the lust killer, Robert Hansen, the thrill killer, and Gacy, the power control killer, I think the differences here are superficial. I think we could call them all compulsive, sexual power motivated serial killers. That is the end of today's lecture. I think I made it just on time. You just saw the first ever lecture on murder in VR. Here are the ones coming up. We got one on Friday. I'd like to thank you all for joining me. I hope I did a good job. And let me just pull a bow out of my emotes here. There you go. Thank you very much. And so I'm going to hang out in here. I'll be hanging out in here. I'm going to put the rope down so you can come down and ask any questions that you may have. And if you'd like to go for a beer at the dive bar, I'll throw up a portal pretty soon. Okay, is that rope gone? No, it's still there. Let's see. Okay. You can come on down if you like.
Can I just ask a question?
Certainly. I'll take as many questions as you like. It's relaxed time for me now.
What did you mean by the FBI would like to say spree killers don't exist anymore?
As in, they had a meeting in San Antonio at the San Antonio Symposium, and they said we no longer consider the category of spree killer to have any validity, and don't exist anymore, which I and many others consider to be a mistake.
Do they have a replacement or?
No, so someone like Christopher Dorner that we looked at as a spree killer, he would likely be folded into a serial killer now. But I think it's pretty clear from me describing the case and the case of all those serial killers that he's very different. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so I have another ally. Bring back spree killers. Let's make it a hashtag. How's that sound?
Works for me.
Yeah.
I think people might take that the wrong way.
Bring back the construct of spree killers.
So
perhaps that's it.
Somebody that murders somebody virtually.
It hasn't happened yet. You wouldn't believe how much I sat and brainstormed and puzzled over, will that ever happen and how? And the only way I could think of would be, and I don't know that this would count, but it could do, if you took a very susceptible person and you convinced them to commit suicide. Or you could use just like any internet medium, okay, so it's got nothing to do with virtual reality or Sansar or anything, but just like in any internet medium,